Give me the dagger and your wrist. She offered both freely. Zayl, with an apologetic expression, wiped clean the blade, then pricked the wrist. Defying gravity, the blood flowed up the point. Zayl watched patiently, despite the constant assault by the monstrosities beyond the bone wall and Astrogah's emergence. "Done," he finally announced, whispering over the dagger's edge. He watched in satisfaction as a dim, green glow covered both weapon and blood. He then handed the dagger back to Selene. "Only you can do this. His bloodline, your blood, your hand. I apologize that it must be so." Wielding the dagger like a fearsome warrior, Selene replied,
Just tell me how to strike. I've lost too much because of that fiend.
"The head. It must be the head. Between the eyes. There was little time."
Then I should go, shouldn't I?
Even as Selene said it, she disappeared. Zayl almost reached out to her, but knew he could not change anything. They were both very much aware that it was possible that, even assuming she succeeded, Selene would perish. The necromancer was determined to do what he could to prevent such from happening. His own blade held ready, he turned to Astrogah. Two more of the macabre limbs had freed themselves, and now they tore off the webbing covering the demon's face.
Yes. To my glory am I returned. The world shall my children devour.
Selene materialized in the back. She thrust the blade in exactly where Zayl had said. The demon howled in agony. The dagger readily slid in. Conveniently. And only because she held on to the hilt did Selene keep from falling to her death. But despite the necromancer's calculations, Astrogah did not die. The moon of the spider had progressed too far for even this method to destroy the demon. He felt torment, certainly, but no more. Clawed hands sought after Lady Nesardo, tearing at her garments with fiendish abandon. Zayl realized that she was so distraught she could not concentrate enough to teleport herself away. "To me, Selene!" he shouted. "With the dagger! Hurry!" The wall of bone suddenly shook, but not due to the efforts of Astrogah's children. Coriolanus, his face white and contorted, stretched forth his hand toward his rival. The barrier shook again, this time pieces crumbling off.
"I will not permit you to undo my years of effort, poisoning the heir to the throne, manipulating that buffoon of a noble, and working on the weak mind of the new king. I will not permit it."
The rest of the wall finally shattered, just as Selene appeared, falling into Zayel's arms.
It didn't work, Zayl.
I know, but there is one more chance. "You have the dagger?" In response, she held up the weapon. In addition to her own blood, there was now on the tip of a dark ichor that Zayl recognized as what passed for some demon's life fluids. Despite the intensity with which Selene had buried the blade into Astrogah, there were only a few drops. It would have to do, but there was still the danger of the other necromancer. "Selene, whatever power you can throw at Coriolanus, do it now! Hurry!" He spoke none too soon, for the armored Rathmanian was already casting. Selene unleashed a raw burst of fire in his direction. Better prepared this time, Coriolanus easily turned it away, ignoring the children of Astrogah who perished in the flames because they stood in its due path. Still, it forced him to begin anew his spell, which was all Zayl asked. As for the demons, all but one of his grotesque limbs was free. Shreds of Lord Jitten's garments hung here and there, and in the monstrous countenance of the arachnid, Zayl could just make out vague features once belonging to the noble. The spider might have not gained Zayel's learning and powers, but Aldrich certainly augmented Astrogah's own. The arachnid was now far more formidable than when he had faced the Vajeri. With 2 limbs, the demon clutched the wound in his head. Black fire coursed in the area as Astrogah healed himself. Yes, it was obviously too late to destroy the fiend, but Zayl no longer had that in mind. Whispering a spell and drawing an oval shape with 3 crosses upon it, the necromancer touched the sacrificial dagger's tip to his own and pointed both, not at Astrogah, but rather at the discarded remains of the Astrogah's former prison. This is the place where you 2 realms are closest, where the boundaries are weakest. Zayl reminded himself as he concentrated. This is why the Vajeri created the sphere here, and why they attempted to destroy this temple afterward. He heard a cry from Selene, but dared not break his concentration. It was now or never. The shell that had been the moon of the spider opened like a flower, or perhaps a hungering mouth. The sphere swelled as it did. Zayl felt a great wind arise, the wind rushing into the artifact.
Oh, I am again.
The giant interacted, not yet noticing what happened behind him. He eyed the necromancer.
Yours, the first blood upon which I will sup.
4 of the limbs darted toward the necromancer, and even then, Zayl did nothing but focus. The clawing, grasping hands came within inches of his body, and could not reach any farther. They struggled against an invisible but irresistible force.
What is this?
I'm returning you to the world you will only ever rule. Demon, yelled the necromancer. The only one you deserve.
The gargantuan spider appeared behind it, and for the first time, Zayl heard fear in the demon's voice.
No, not there. In there I will not go. Never again.
But you must. You have no choice. Within the swollen shell, the vast emptiness beckoned. The wind grew stronger. Zayl's cloak flowed madly toward the artifact. The rough manian was able to stand his ground. One of Jitten's transformed servants was ripped from the wall to which it clung, and it went flying past both Zayl and the demon, vanishing into the shell. Another followed, then another. As the children of Astrogah, they were cursed as the demon was, and so had to share its fate. However, then something else happened for which the rough manian had not planned. On the ground near the altar, Sardak's body shook as if suddenly alive. It slid slightly toward the direction of the shell, only to become caught between several large chunks of stone that had fallen from the ceiling. The Nesardos, too, were bound to Astrogah, which meant that they were also in danger of being sucked into the orb. Turning for Selene, Zayl momentarily dared take his focus off his spell. Only then did he discover that, to his horror, she lay unmoving on the floor. Her body also sought to slide toward the sphere, but like her brothers had momentarily become wedged. The necromancer tried to reach her, only to be suddenly pulled toward the struggling Astrogah. The demon had managed to snag his leg. The small but vicious clawed hands tore at his garments, ripping through the skin in some places. Leg nearly buckling, Zayl tore his dagger from the spellwork and slashed at the clutching hands. Hissing, the demon released his hold. Astrogah now clung on to the edges of the gigantic shell, desperately seeking purchase. He spat webbing Zayl's way, but it landed short, draping over the altar. If the demon thought the heavy stone piece would save him, he was horribly mistaken. Instead, as the tension increased, the altar came loose. The demon's efforts to pull himself toward it instead sent the altar flying at him like a catapult missile. It struck the spider full in the torso. Astrogah's grip failed. With a frantic hiss, the giant arachnid went spiraling into the blackness.
No!
Astrogah vanished. The orb continued to suck in all things bound to the arachnid. Behind him came the rest of his horrific children, each of the creatures scrambling for purchase they could not find. Zayl felt even the sacrificial dagger seek to follow Astrogah into the shell, but the rough manian needed a few moments more. He had to be absolutely certain that the spear would seal. An armored forearm wrapped around his throat. In his ear he heard Caribidas' snarl.
You have ruined everything. The balance may never be put even now, you blind fool.
The only one blind, Zayl managed, twisting around so that the two faced one another, is you, Caribidas. Blind to your madness, to your evil. The older necromancer paid his words no mind.
Give me the dagger. There is still time to remedy this.
Few moments had there been in his life when Zayl had felt true rage. The greatest was that day when his spell needed to cast out the evil against which his parents had fought, also destroyed by cleansing fire everyone. But Zayl had survived, almost completely unscathed, had ignited an anger at himself for with which he had fought for years afterward. He had even dared the unthinkable, trying to fully resurrect his parents and, in their place, give his soul to the realm of the dead. Only the work of his mentors had kept him from creating an even worse disaster and finally forced him to come to grips with the fact that he could not have changed what happened to only the ones for whom he had ever deeply cared. But if there was an anger approaching that, it was what Zayl now felt for Caribidas, whom he had once admired so greatly. Caribidas had made an abomination out of everything Zayl believed in. He had become what all outsiders feared the Rothmanians were. Worse, at their feet lay a woman who had come to Zayl for help, a woman who had affected him in a manner unaccustomed. The thought that Selene was dead at Caribidas' hand, was the final impetus the younger necromancer needed. The dagger is yours, Caribidas, he cried into the other face. May the dragon take you both. He thrust Astrogah's blade into his adversary's chest. Where nothing else had penetrated the enhanced armor, the demonic dagger, fueled by every last iota of Zayl's magic and even more by his will, bore through the metal as if it were soft mud. Caribidas gaped as the blade cut through his black, soul-lost heart. Zayl spun him around so that the gray-haired spellcaster's back was to the closing shell. Balance shall be maintained, he whispered to Caribidas. Zayl shoved his foe as hard as he could, releasing his grip on the dagger. Caribidas made him desperate but feeble grab at Zayel's cloak, and failed. With a wordless cry, the armored necromancer went hurling after the spider demon in his fiendish get. Caribidas struck the gap just before it would have been too small to take him. He grasped at the edges, but with no more success than Astrogah, Caribidas was sucked inside. His scream ended only when the moon of the spider at last sealed itself shut. Then Zayl dropped to one knee. Around them, the temple, stressed far too much by the powerful forces in play, began collapsing. The necromancer paid a little mind, caught between his regret for Selene and the sinister orb. As the insidious lunar phase finally passed, the sphere suddenly began to shrink, rapidly returning to its former state. Zayl knew that he had to do one last thing. Even if the temple was falling apart, the moon of the spider could not remain here. It was too close to the weakness between the planes. Even the slightest risk that Astrogah might somehow free himself again could not be taken. And then there was Caribidas. Zayl tried to rise, and when that failed, forced himself to crawl. The orb, now no longer that when Aldrich had wielded it, taunted him with its closeness, but more than more Zayl suspected that it would remain out of his reach. He could go no farther. Then, a pair of powerful hands gripped him at the shoulders, lifting him as if he were a baby. Zayl could only imagine that the Night Howler had somehow survived and now sought to aid him. He tried to thank the unseen forest dweller, but words proved past him. At last Zayl could touch the moon. Clinging to it for support, He pressed his dagger against the side and uttered one last spell. They came as shadows, all three. He had felt their distant presence since the first time he had come here. Little more than shadows. They were still clearly to him Bajuri. Caribitis had done something upon entering this place to eradicate their threat, but even as only memories of men, they would do for Zayl. Swallowing, he managed to say, "The moon. Take it. I command you to bury at the bottom of the deepest point in the most obscure body of water possible. There, never to be found by man, demon, or angel ever again." The middle of the three reached down and, with hands of smoke, took the moon as spider into his vaporous arms. "It will be done," came a whisper in the necromancer's ear. And with that, the specters and orb disappeared. Hurling onto his bag, Zayl prepared to order the Night Howler to take Selene's body back to the gates of the city so that she could at least have a proper burial. To his surprise, however, nothing stood above him. When he twisted his head to the side, it was to discover that the Night Howler lay where he had last seen the fur giant. The creature had done nothing to help him. In fact, Zayl finally recalled that he had even summoned the brave creature's spirit against Caribitis. Then what? Before he could answer that question, a groan from his side made him tense. A feminine groan with only one possible source. Turning back on his stomach, Zayl attempted to crawl again. A second groan reached his ears. "Selene. Selene." And suddenly, the Rathmanian heard.
Zayl?
He permitted himself a brief smile, then promptly passed out. Throughout the city, and especially where General Torion fought, the situation had grown beyond hope. There seemed more spiders than leaves on the trees of the entire forest, and they moved with a relentlessness unmatched by even the most dedicated defender. In the general's mind, it was the end of Westmarch. But then, a strange and glorious thing happened. As when the sea of arachnids came to an abrupt halt, they simply ceased moving, certain that it was some horrific trick. Humans hesitated, and then before their eyes, spiders began decaying. By the hundreds, they simply crumbled to ash, as if something had drained all life from them in one astonishing instant. Some were caught in mid-stride, others atop their hosts. Wherever they were seen, they perished there, and then without at least warning. Now, covered in ash and bereft of any control, their victims collapsed like ragdolls. The falling bodies scattered in the dust, and that had been the terror of the kingdom. And the rain, now pouring harder, quickly began washing away the nightmare. Someone let out a nervous laugh. It proved contagious, spreading from one survivor to the other in the space of a few seconds. The laughter, more of a relief than anything else, soon encompassed the capital. And General Torion, commander of the king's forces, laughed the loudest, for he knew better than any other what sort of escape had been granted to not only his people, but to the rest of the land.